White supremacist movements constitute a persistent yet fundamentally ineffective phenomenon in global politics, defined by strategies of public spectacle that systematically undermine their stated objectives of racial dominance. These groups prioritize marches, rallies, and paramilitary displays over electoral engagement or legislative advocacy, resulting in consistent isolation from broader societal support. The central analysis posits that such tactics represent controlled opposition, whereby overt expressions of racial animosity serve adversarial interests by generating public revulsion and enabling institutional suppression. Historically, white supremacist activism has rejected the integrated approaches, combining protest with political organization and resource mobilization that characterize successful social movements. Instead, reliance on isolated spectacle ensures marginalization, as evidenced by repeated organizational collapses following high-profile demonstrations. Across continents, from American urban centers to European capitals and Australian suburbs, the pattern remains uniform. Provocative actions provoke backlash without translating into policy influence or power acquisition. This exposition adopts a critical perspective, arguing that white supremacist methods actively harm racial interests by design, functioning as mechanisms to reinforce multicultural frameworks they oppose. The professional academic tone maintains that these movements embody strategic incompetence, their activism not merely ineffective but instrumentally advancing opposing agendas. The analysis reveals a profound disconnect between intended racial assertion and achieved outcomes of deepened exclusion, where each demonstration compounds cumulative disadvantage through predictable cycles of provocation and retreat. Expanding this framework, the critique encompasses the full operational spectrum, from initial mobilization to inevitable dissolution, highlighting how spectacle becomes the primary barrier to substantive influence. Structurally, the analysis proceeds through 4 progressive sections. Historical precedents establish the pattern of failure, contemporary American cases illustrate domestic dysfunction, international examples confirm global repetition, and conspiracy frameworks explain manipulative dynamics. Each section builds conceptually toward a unified conclusion condemning white supremacy as a self-defeating enterprise. The overarching argument emphasizes that without integration into formal political processes, white supremacist spectacle devolves into performative futility, alienating potential allies and strengthening institutional adversaries. This treatise presents an original examination of racial activism's core contradictions, demonstrating how public displays of supremacy perpetuate the very disempowerment they seek to overcome. The critical lens underscores strategic inversion. Methods intended to assert dominance instead validate suppression, transforming racial advocacy into its own antithesis. Professional analysis reveals white supremacist groups as structurally flawed entities, their global operations unified by shared incompetence rather than coordinated efficacy. The introduction frames this progression. Recognition of historical isolation leads to contemporary critique, extends to international parallels, and culminates in explanatory mechanisms of subversion. Subsequent sections develop this framework with academic precision, avoiding extraneous detail to focus on conceptual clarity. The biased yet professional assessment concludes that white supremacist activism represents a pathological deviation from effective political strategy, ensuring perpetual irrelevance through self-imposed limitations. Expanding the conceptual scope, this exposition illuminates the recurring cycle of mobilization and marginalization, where ideological purity overrides pragmatic adaptation, solidifying strategic paralysis as the defining characteristic of racial movements. This exposition thus serves as a comprehensive indictment of racial movements that prioritize visibility over viability, expanding the conceptual scope to encompass the full spectrum of strategic miscalculation inherent in their operational model. By methodically dissecting each phase of white supremacist endeavor, the analysis illuminates the recurring cycle of provocation and retreat, where initial displays of resolve inevitably yield to institutional containment. The professional commitment to rigor ensures that every assertion rests on observable patterns of organizational behavior, reinforcing the central thesis that spectacle without substance constitutes the definitive barrier to racial influence. In this manner, the introduction not only orients the reader, but also establishes the analytical foundation for a systematic deconstruction of white supremacy's inherent contradictions, providing expanded depth to the examination of global patterns and their unified implications for racial strategy. The critical perspective maintains focus on operational dynamics, revealing how isolated tactics foster environments of sustained disadvantage, ultimately positioning white supremacist activism as a paradigmatic case of self-perpetuating failure across historical and contemporary contexts. Part 1. Historical precedents of self-destructive activism. Historical analysis demonstrates that white supremacist marches consistently result in organizational collapse when pursued without political integration, establishing a pattern of strategic self-destruction. Early 20th century public demonstrations generated temporary attention but alienated mainstream support, leading to rapid decline as public opinion turned against overt racial activism. Without accompanying electoral campaigns or institutional alliances, these spectacles isolated advocates from positions of influence, converting potential strength into widespread condemnation. Critical examination reveals this outcome as inherent to unintegrated strategy, where reliance on visual provocation substitutes for substantive power building. The professional perspective identifies historical marches as foundational errors, severing racial movements from the pragmatic pathways that sustained other advocacy efforts. Conceptual clarity emerges through recognition that isolated activism functions as a mechanism of self-limitation, ensuring marginalization across eras. This historical trajectory underscores the fundamental disconnect between spectacle and sovereignty, where public displays serve primarily as catalysts for oppositional consolidation rather than vehicles for advancement. The biased assessment expands this view to highlight how such patterns prefigure modern failures, creating a continuum of strategic short-sightedness that defines white supremacist evolution. Expanding further, the analysis traces the evolution from localized enforcement to national exhibitionism, revealing consistent operational flaws that perpetuate irrelevance through successive generations. This historical failure arises from deliberate rejection of multifaceted approaches, contrasting movements that successfully combined public action with legislative lobbying and organizational funding. White supremacist groups historically favored purity of message over coalition building, their demonstrations devolving into catalysts for legal and social backlash. The academic tone emphasizes that such isolation constitutes strategic malpractice, historical evidence confirming that spectacle without structure yields institutional extinction. Antebellum racial enforcement succeeded through direct political control rather than public display, while later iterations reverted to feudal exhibitionism, guaranteeing obsolescence. Conceptual development highlights the causal link. Disconnection from formal processes breeds inevitable defeat, marches serving as primary vehicles of isolation. Expanding this analysis reveals deeper structural flaws, where ideological rigidity precluded adaptation to changing political landscapes, perpetuating cycles of emergence and dissolution. The professional critique maintains that this rejection of integration represents not mere oversight but active commitment to self-defeating principles, ensuring historical irrelevance through repeated operational missteps. The examination further elucidates how these patterns established enduring templates of failure, influencing subsequent iterations with unyielding consistency, and reinforcing the centrality of strategic isolation to white supremacist identity. The overarching historical assessment condemns white supremacist precedents as blueprints for failure, their unintegrated spectacles, ensuring structural weakness. Critical analysis affirms this legacy as self-engineered vulnerability, whereby public activism advanced opposing consolidation of authority. Professional synthesis positions historical patterns as predictive models, demonstrating that strategic isolation perpetuates racial disadvantage. This section establishes the analytical foundation, progressing to contemporary application with conceptual rigor, while expanding the scope to encompass the full implications of historical determinism in shaping current strategic paralysis. By tracing the complete arc from origin to outcome, the analysis solidifies the thesis that disconnection from political reality remains the cornerstone of white supremacist defeat, providing comprehensive foundation for subsequent sections through detailed elaboration of causal mechanisms and their lasting consequences. Part 2. Contemporary American Models of Strategic Failure. Contemporary American white supremacist activism exemplifies strategic dysfunction through reliance on marches and paramilitary displays, producing isolation rather than influence. Current demonstrations provoke immediate institutional response, alienating moderate constituencies while providing pretext for enhanced regulatory measures. Without electoral participation, these actions remain confined to fringe visibility, failing to penetrate formal political structures. Critical evaluation identifies this pattern as controlled dysfunction, whereby overt racial expression strengthens mechanisms of suppression. The professional perspective frames American activism as a case study in performative limitation, its methods rejecting governance in favor of repetitive exhibition. Conceptual organization clarifies that domestic movements operate as closed systems, their internal logic precluding external efficacy. This operational model extends beyond immediate events to encompass broader cultural reinforcement of oppositional narratives, where each display compounds cumulative disadvantage. The biased assessment deepens this critique by emphasizing how contemporary tactics replicate historical errors with amplified consequences in a media-saturated environment. Expanding the scope, the analysis reveals sophisticated mechanisms of self-containment, where organizational cohesion masks profound external impotence across diverse regional contexts. This American pathology persists through adherence to isolated tactics, distinguishing current efforts from pragmatic models that integrate public action with political candidacy. White supremacist groups prioritize ideological consistency over adaptive strategy, their rallies reinforcing rather than challenging dominant frameworks. The academic assessment deems such approaches fundamentally flawed, contemporary patterns verifying that public spectacle entrenches oppositional dominance. Paramilitary exercises in remote areas symbolize this disconnect, preparation without application that ensures continued marginalization. Conceptual advancement underscores the paradox. Activities designed for empowerment instead validate exclusionary policies. Expanding the analysis reveals systemic reinforcement, where domestic isolation feeds national policy alignments that further entrench disadvantage. The professional tone maintains that this adherence constitutes deliberate strategic stagnation, contemporary movements embodying refined versions of historical incompetence tailored to modern surveillance capabilities. The critique further elaborates how these tactics sustain internal unity at the expense of broader viability, creating self-perpetuating cycles of provocation that solidify American white supremacy status as strategically bankrupt. Unified contemporary analysis indicts American white supremacy as a model of strategic failure, its spectacles advancing adversarial interests through predictable self-sabotage. Critical perspective exposes the operational contradiction, racial assertion manifesting as deepened subordination. This section transitions to international examination, providing rigorous foundation for global extension, while broadening the conceptual framework to illustrate American activism as paradigmatic of worldwide dysfunction. Through comprehensive elaboration of domestic dynamics, the analysis bridges historical precedent to present reality, ensuring conceptual coherence and positioning contemporary cases as definitive illustrations of white supremacist futility across operational dimensions. Part 3. International replication of global futility. International white supremacist movements replicate American patterns of futility, their global marches demonstrating uniform strategic incompetence across regions. European rallies and Australian processions generate localized outrage but secure no parliamentary representation, isolating advocates from governing coalitions. Without integration into national political systems, these actions provoke transnational regulatory alignment, strengthening unified opposition. Critical analysis reveals international activism as synchronized ineffectiveness, overt displays serving to harmonize adversarial responses. The professional viewpoint positions global efforts as interconnected failures, their shared methodology ensuring collective marginalization. Conceptual framework illuminates that worldwide movements constitute a single flawed paradigm, spectacle substituting for sovereign engagement. This global synchronization extends to coordinated media amplification, where regional events collectively reinforce supranational suppression narratives. The biased assessment expands this view to underscore how international uniformity amplifies individual failures into systemic inevitability. Expanding further, the examination traces cross-border operational linkages, revealing how regional variations mask underlying strategic uniformity across diverse geopolitical contexts. This international replication stems from universal rejection of integrated strategy, setting white supremacist efforts apart from successful transnational advocacy. Groups worldwide emphasize message purity over diplomatic alliance, their demonstrations catalyzing supranational backlash rather than bilateral gains. The academic evaluation characterizes such uniformity as systemic error, global patterns confirming that isolated activism reinforces multicultural governance. Processions through major cities exemplify this limitation, symbolic defiance without structural impact. Conceptual progression emphasizes interconnected defeat. Regional spectacles contribute to worldwide strategic obsolescence. Expanding the critique reveals deeper geopolitical implications, where international isolation facilitates unified institutional responses across sovereign boundaries. The professional synthesis maintains that this rejection represents collective strategic abdication, global movements unified in their commitment to self-perpetuating disadvantage. The analysis further details how these patterns create feedback loops of escalating isolation, perpetuating worldwide white supremacy as a monument to collective miscalculation through sustained operational consistency. The comprehensive international assessment condemns global white supremacy as a monolithic exercise in irrelevance, its unified marches perpetuating collective disadvantage. Critical synthesis affirms this dynamic as engineered repetition, whereby public activism consolidates opposing authority structures. This section completes the empirical progression, leading to analytical explanation, while extending the conceptual scope to encompass the full transnational dimensions of strategic failure. Through detailed elaboration of cross-continental patterns, the analysis solidifies the universality of white supremacist incompetence, providing robust foundation for subversive interpretation and ensuring comprehensive coverage of global operational dynamics. Part 4. Subversive Mechanisms and Controlled Opposition. Analytical frameworks of subversion explain white supremacist failure as intentional structural manipulation, converting racial strategy into oppositional utility. Theories of controlled opposition identify public demonstrations as engineered provocations, designed to justify institutional expansion against perceived threats. Overt activism becomes predictable theater, its racial content weaponized to legitimize regulatory frameworks. Critical examination discloses this mechanism as masterful redirection, whereby supremacist intent advances contrary consolidation. The professional analysis conceptualizes subversion as operational hijacking, transforming advocacy into self-reinforcing containment. Strategic clarity emerges. Manipulated movements function as perpetual justification for adversarial dominance. This framework extends beyond individual events to encompass systemic operational control, where global coordination ensures comprehensive containment. The bias perspective deepens this analysis by highlighting how subversion exploits inherent strategic vulnerabilities for maximum oppositional benefit. Expanding the scope, the critique traces layered implementation across historical and contemporary contexts, revealing deliberate design as the unifying principle of persistent failure. This subversive dynamic exploits internal strategic rigidity, ensuring that white supremacist adherence to spectacle precludes adaptive response. Groups maintain ideological consistency at the cost of organizational survival, their demonstrations feeding cycles of legal and social restriction. The academic perspective deems such exploitation systematic, analytical patterns verifying that controlled activism perpetuates subordination. Infiltration narratives illustrate existential redirection, racial objectives subverted into instruments of exclusion. Conceptual development stresses deliberate design. Subversion guarantees that global marches serve unified oppositional purposes. Expanding the examination reveals layered implementation, where internal contradictions become external operational advantages for adversaries. The professional critique affirms that this exploitation constitutes the definitive explanation for persistent failure, subversion transforming potential resistance into foundational support for dominant structures. The analysis further elaborates how these mechanisms sustain long-term containment, ensuring white supremacist movements remain perpetual instruments of their own suppression through sophisticated operational control. Unified analytical synthesis indicts white supremacist subversion as comprehensive strategic perversion, its mechanisms ensuring perpetual operational defeat. Critical assessment confirms the explanatory power of controlled opposition, whereby racial movements become foundational to their own suppression. This section concludes the progressive structure, forging pathway to final synthesis, while broadening the conceptual analysis to fully illuminate the manipulative architecture underlying global racial activism. Through exhaustive elaboration of subversive dynamics, the examination provides conclusive explanatory framework, solidifying subversion as the ultimate determinant of white supremacist futility across all operational dimensions. Conclusion: unified indictment of perpetual racial disadvantage. White supremacist movements worldwide manifest strategic tragedy through their unwavering commitment to isolated spectacle, culminating in systematic racial disadvantage that permeates every operational dimension. Historical patterns of March-induced collapse establish the foundational error of unintegrated activism, where early demonstrations consistently dissolved organizations into obscurity without leaving any trace of institutional influence. Contemporary American displays illustrate domestic operational failure absent political engagement, as urban rallies and remote paramilitary exercises provoke immediate backlash while failing to secure even minimal legislative footholds. International replication across continents confirms global uniformity of incompetence, with European processions and Australian gatherings provoking coordinated institutional response without achieving governance penetration or policy concessions. Subversive mechanisms provide the final explanatory layer, transforming racial strategy into controlled instruments of oppositional consolidation that systematically redirect supremacist energy towards self-reinforcement of adversarial structures. The professional synthesis condemns this progression as an inherent structural flaw embedded within white supremacy itself, rejecting viable pathways of electoral integration in favor of self-defeating exhibition that guarantees sustained marginalization. Critical assessment reveals operational inversion at the core. Methods explicitly designed for dominance instead produce deepened exclusion, public activism actively validating the very multicultural frameworks it seeks to dismantle through predictable cycles of provocation and retreat. This comprehensive tracing from historical origin through contemporary execution illuminates the complete arc of failure, where each phase reinforces the next in unyielding progression toward obsolescence. Overarching analysis unifies these disparate elements into a singular indictment. Racial movements harm their own objectives through predictable dysfunction, marches serving as primary vehicles of exclusion that alienate potential constituencies and strengthen institutional adversaries. Rare pragmatic exceptions underscore the pathology with stark clarity, demonstrating that integrated governance alone achieves lasting influence through sustained policy implementation, yet predominant adherence to spectacle precludes such evolution by maintaining ideological purity at the expense of operational viability. The academic perspective resolves with comprehensive judgment. White supremacist activism constitutes a deviant political form entirely divorced from effective strategy, its global operations defined by shared irrelevance rather than coordinated advancement or territorial gains. Conceptual synthesis affirms strategic futility as the core characteristic defining all manifestations, isolated displays ensuring perpetual subordination to multicultural authority through mechanisms of self-imposed limitation. Expanding this resolution reveals deeper implications for racial dynamics, where worldwide commitment to spectacle transforms assertive racial identity into institutional reinforcement of opposing dominance, completing the full analytical progression with unyielding conceptual rigor. Professional elaboration further emphasizes how this unified pattern transcends regional boundaries, creating a self-perpetuating global ecosystem where each demonstration feeds the next cycle of containment and decline. The critical lens maintains unwavering focus on operational totality, exposing the intricate interconnections that render white supremacy not merely ineffective but actively counterproductive to its foundational premises. Professional conclusion emphasizes that rejection of performative methods for formal engagement represents the sole corrective path toward potential efficacy, though entrenched patterns of ideological rigidity render meaningful reform improbable and structurally unattainable. This treatise finalizes its examination with unequivocal verdict. White supremacy embodies self-engineered obsolescence on a global scale. Its worldwide commitment to spectacle systematically converting racial assertion into foundational support for institutional reinforcement of opposing dominance. By methodically tracing the complete analytical arc from historical precedents through international replication to subversive culmination, the synthesis reveals white supremacy as the paradigmatic case of strategic self-annihilation, where isolation becomes destiny and spectacle equates to surrender. The biased yet professional assessment delivers final condemnation. Racial movements that prioritize visibility over viability perpetuate their own irrelevance, ensuring that each march advances not white interests but the very multicultural hegemony they profess to oppose, thereby achieving the ultimate inversion of purpose through sustained commitment to operational futility.